Thank you. Man liels prieks, boet pie jums Latvia. I hope that means what I think it means. My great friend Andris Berzins told me that that's what I needed to say. Whenever I see somebody from Latvia, I say, I've got a great friend, Andris Berzins, you must know him. And everyone's like, yeah, I know Andris Berzins. And I'm like, wow, he must be the most famous guy in Latvia. It turns out that it's apparently quite a common name here. I'm going to talk about hiring today. And internationalization is a part of what I'm going to be talking about, because really the problems that I deal with every day, or my clients deal with every day, and the challenges I've been really facing my whole career have been challenges of growth. And with growth, particularly from a country like Latvia with a small domestic market, really that means internationalization, it means expansion of your team, and all of those challenges. My career has been quite varied. I started out life as a barrister, including some time spent in the European Commission. I was then an entrepreneur, and I built a business which was predominantly based in London and New York. This was in the financial markets business, which we sold to an American public company in 2008. I then joined Google, where I oversaw our partnerships throughout Europe, Middle East, and Africa, particularly partnerships relating to e-commerce, but also syndication, distribution. And so I learned a lot about what it means to be a truly international business. I subsequently moved to Live Bookings, where I ran a team in, I think, 7 countries, and we were active, the company was active in 23 companies. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the challenges that you guys will be seeing every day, and I hope during the course of the next 45 minutes or so to address some of the issues that you guys will be encountering. Most recently, I've joined the Up Group. The Up Group is an executive search firm, and what we do is, first of all, we focused entirely on the digital economy, and we work with companies to help them solve really, really thorny challenges of scale, particularly when it comes to organizational planning. And so really what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the things that we've learned, some of the do's and don'ts around hiring when you're growing really, really fast. A little bit about the Up Group. Our mission is to build great leadership teams for great companies, and our clients really range across the digital landscape, from the global giants, including Google and recently Facebook, eBay, and so on, to the really small guys, the guys that are growing fast, typically post-Series A, but then all the way on up through pre-IPO, post-IPO, private equity-owned, growth capital companies, and increasingly corporates in the traditional sectors who are themselves undergoing transformation as they confront some of the challenges of the new business environment that we're all facing. We operate throughout the world, but our sweet spot is Europe. And what we do is, as I said, really around creative problem solving. We're no longer in a scenario where the answers are easy, where if you have a chief marketing officer that you need to hire, the role is obvious, the talent pool is clear, and it's really a question of shuffling the deck chairs. We're no longer in that situation. Half the time our clients don't even know what business they're in. They think they know. They know what business they're in today. Is that going to be the same business they're in 6 months' time? Is their company going to be the same company in 6 months' time? In most cases the answer is no. When they're looking to hire, they're looking to hire for 3 companies. They're looking to hire for the company they are today, the company they'll be in a year, and the company they'll be in 5 years. And those are 3 completely different companies. Some of these roles have existed for a year. Some of these roles don't really exist at all. Most often, they don't really even know what roles they're hiring for. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that has to get done, and it has to get done really, really fast. That's what they know. what that looks like and how that's going to evolve, where we look, who we look for, and then what we say to the people that we find. All of those are problems that we need to help them solve. I'm going to talk about 8 scenarios, and these are common scenarios. They've been distilled from 1,000,001 different things that we come across all the time. These are some things that we come across a lot. Right? These are things that we see all the time. These are particularly difficult scenarios that all companies that are growing fast go through. And as I say, some of this would touch on international growth, but all of it will be issues that you will find yourself facing or will have already faced when you grow fast. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those problems are and some of the do's and don'ts that we've found to be helpful as we've worked with our clients to address these scenarios. Hiring fast is really, really hard. Very, very few companies do it well. There are a number of problems that are just endemic with hiring at scale. The first problem is that there just isn't a hell of a lot of talent out there. You know, the world economy, and particularly the economy that, the sort of digital economy, I suppose, if I can use that term very broadly, is one where the demand is far outstripping the supply in terms of talent. I mean, there's just no way around it, and that's true in every market. You know, when I think of some of these new roles that are emerging, you know, we're increasingly hiring sort of chief data officers. I mean, the concept of a chief data officer is something that's really been around for 5 minutes. You've always had analysts at some level in the organization. That role is very, very fast migrating up the corporate ladder. Now, where do we find chief data officers? They don't really exist. We have to somehow, you know, this is a thorny problem. It's not a question of just making a hire. This is a question of really challenging ourselves to think, well, hang on a sec, what do we mean? What does this person look like? What does this person have to do, and where are they going to come from? It's hard. There just isn't a huge amount of obvious talent. There's a lot of talent. It's just never obvious, right? But a bigger problem with hiring fast, and this is, I don't think, well enough understood, is the problem of the opportunity costs of paying attention and taking hiring seriously. When you're growing fast and you need, you know, then by definition, there are huge vistas of opportunity open to you. And the bottleneck is finding people to manage those opportunities, right? Finding people to manage the operations to take advantage of those opportunities. If you don't have those people, then the risk is that those opportunities will pass you by, that your competitors will come in, that you'll run out of money, etc., etc. There's a huge, huge, huge business imperative to fill that role, fill those roles, so that you can grow fast, okay? It becomes a real bottleneck on growth. And in that scenario, and I've been in this situation, and I'm sure many of you would have been in this situation, you as the CEO or as the business leader, in whatever capacity you're working in, what you really want to be doing with your time is helping your business grow, right? What you're doing with your time is solving the millions and millions of problems that you have to face every day as your business grows. What you don't want to be doing is spending hours interviewing people, right? I've been there. I know what it's like. You sit there and you just think, my God, you know, I'm sitting here, there's probably 50 emails in my inbox while I'm sitting here talking to you, right? And so it is very, very, very hard in those circumstances, with those opportunity costs, to actually spend the time and devote the mental energy necessary to making sure that you hire well. It is hugely tempting. If you find somebody who can just about do the job that needs to get done, to hire that person. Hugely tempting, happens all the time, in companies large and small, right? This is a real problem. This is a real problem. In all of our experience, and my personal experience in small entrepreneurial growth and large companies, it is far better to have a gap than a bad hire, particularly at senior levels. And that becomes more acute the faster you're growing and the smaller the business is, right? Having a gap is something that is temporary and can be filled. A bad hire has repercussions that can endure. And again, I'm seeing a few nodding faces. This is obvious. I don't think that's news to anyone. That's something which I guess most people would just agree with. The problem is, what do you do about it, right? So first of all, once you've acknowledged it, you have to force yourself to slow down. Later on this afternoon, you'll hear from a speaker from Google. When I worked at Google, Google had a very effective way of forcing themselves to slow down. I think I had 15 interviews at Google. I'm sure this has changed, right? But in those days, they didn't, it was growing so fast, they didn't really have particularly robust hiring systems. I mean, I'd be asked the same question 30 times. I can say all this because I'm an ex-Googler, so I don't have to be discreet, but sometimes I'd sort of turn up, the person who was supposed to interview me would walk into the room and would be surprised to see me there, which is a sort of slightly odd situation if you're a candidate. But it was extremely effective, because what it did is it forced them to slow down. If you couldn't get in unless you'd had, 7 people all saying you're great, right, that is a real guarantor, albeit inefficient, of quality, of cultural fit, and all the rest of it. So that is one technique. It's not a technique that most companies can adopt because, frankly, most companies don't have the luxury of being able to wait and being able to throw all these really productive people at the problem. But it illustrates the point that you need to force yourself to slow down. That could be, it could be having a bar, a hiring bar, for example, a particular sort of educational attainment. Force yourself to stick to that. Do not compromise. Okay? Put in place, in the same way as when you quit smoking, hide the cigarettes. It's really exactly analogous to that. You absolutely need to reference properly. It's the first thing that falls down when you're trying to hire fast. Okay, so you force yourself to slow down. You've acknowledged that it's better to wait than to hire badly. You found someone. This person's been through the process. This person, everyone loves this person. This person has met all the hiring criteria. It takes a will of iron to reference properly, right? You're so excited this person has finally found his or her way into your company. Who's going to spend the time? Who's going to spend the hours taking references? And I've seen time and time again what happens when you don't reference well. What happens is you end up with a bad hire. Finally, if you're forced to go fast, if you can't do all these things, or even if you can, really make sure that you have probationary periods. There's only one thing worse than making a mistake, and that's not being able to fix that mistake. Right? Sometimes things go wrong, even if you do it well. Don't find yourself stuck with somebody who's not right for your business. Let me talk about a specific issue which crops up a lot, and this is highly relevant, I suppose, to what's being discussed today, which is the first senior international hire. Why is this a difficult issue? Why do people have such problems with this? You think this would be relatively straightforward. The problem is as follows. If you want a great person, well, first of all, you need a great person. If you're going to expand into some other country, you want a top person running that, right? Because you want someone who you can completely rely on, for obvious reasons, because you're not going to be there, right? So you want a top person. If you want a top person, right, then you have to acknowledge that these people are smart, and these people are going to be instinctively suspicious of these sorts of roles. Why? Because there's a whole bunch of assumptions that go into these roles, which the hiring manager or the company that's hiring don't necessarily understand, but the candidate will absolutely pick up on. So one of these assumptions that the candidate will have to just make is, for example, that the company is committed to international expansion. So you, as the hiring company, may know that, you've written the business plan, right? Your business plan says, hire 10 people in the UK and they're going to be responsible for driving £100 million of revenue. You may know that, but the person you're interviewing won't know that, and the person you're interviewing, even if they know that that's in your business plan, will still doubt your commitment. He'll come in with a default position that, you know what, I'm not so sure about this, because what happens in real life? What happens in real life is that when things go wrong, the first thing that happens is that companies retrench from their markets that are not perceived to be core. The fact that the company is not already in your market suggests that your market is not core to the company, right? So that's a real challenge. The other assumption is as follows. The assumption is that this person, who is a senior person, let's remember, the assumption that this person will need to make, or rather something that this person will need to be persuaded of, is that this person's voice is going to be heard at senior level. And the assumption will be that this person's voice won't be heard. Why? Because anyone who's ever worked in a branch office of a company will know that that's what tends to happen. What tends to happen is that you're the voice on the speaker in the middle of the table, right? What tends to happen is that meetings get scheduled around the availability of the people in head office, not your availability. What happens is you end up being called into meetings at 2 in the morning, if you're working for a company on the West Coast, right? The assumption is that regardless of what's being said, the assumption of a smart candidate is that, you know what, that this might be called a VP international, and it might be a GM role, and I might have lots of different functions, but ultimately, is my voice really going to be heard? Am I actually going to be able to make the business impact that I expect to make? That's something which has to be addressed. And the problem is, if you don't address these things, you're going to end up with candidates who are not that smart, right? So to avoid that, here are some of the things we suggest. You need to involve the hiring manager. Again, of course, this depends very much on the size of your company. If you're a smaller company, then the hiring manager will, of course, be involved earlier. But with larger companies, oftentimes, it's the HR function that will do the initial scoping out, they'll do the initial interviews, sometimes do the initial meetings. You need to involve the hiring manager much earlier in the process when you're making this kind of hire, okay? Because that builds trust, right? And it allows an open conversation to happen at a meaningful level a lot earlier, and it needs to happen that way, which means you need to get on a plane, okay? I've been headhunted over the years more times than I can remember for VP international roles for typically American companies, but not only American companies, GM UK roles, VP Europe. They all have different names and they all cover different territories, but the principle is the same. And honestly, the number of times where the hiring manager has got on a plane and come and sat in front of me, probably 10 or 20% of the time. And the rest of the time, I'm not interested. Because I'm making all of these assumptions, right? I'm making these assumptions. And unless there's someone there who I can speak to, I'm just going to, I'm just not interested in this. There's too much risk associated with this role. You need to be creative and you need to be generous, right? Regardless of all of these, how much communication and reassurance, etc., the candidate will always see themselves as taking a risk over and above the normal risk that you take when you join a new company, right? They'll always see it that way, so you need to be generous. You need to be creative. And really, don't try tricks, because this happens a lot. You think, you know what, I want to get a great person in Germany, so I'm going to call this role CEO Germany, right? I do see that. It doesn't work. It makes your company look silly. There's only one CEO, basically, unless you're, I don't know, GM or something, where you can be the CEO who's not the real CEO and still have 20,000 people reporting to you. It kind of feels a bit like you're a CEO. Unless, maybe I'm mistaken, but most of you guys are probably not that scale yet. There's only one, so don't play tricks. Preempt concerns, reassure. This is an interesting one, and again, I don't know if this applies to any of you in this room, but something we see a lot. As companies grow, sometimes they outgrow a founder. And this presents a really, really thorny set of challenges. One of the interesting things about this is that actually the number of scenarios around this is not, and no two are the same. Sometimes, in the best scenarios, founders acknowledge that they've reached the point where actually they're not really the right person to be at that level, which is usually CEO level, at that phase of the company's growth. And it's in their interest, in the business interest, to actually step aside, typically into another role, and bring on board someone who's more used to that phase, right? Somebody who's taken the company from 10 million to 100 million, whatever, that happens. But actually, I think those are probably in the minority. What's more common is that either companies are not as successful as the original founding team hoped and the original investors hoped, or they are successful, but it becomes obvious to the investors, but not to the founder, that the founder is no longer the right person to be the leader. So how do you deal with this scenario if you're in the position of having to replace a founder, or if you're a candidate? Of course, the two things always go hand in hand. If you're having to replace a founder, and indeed this is true if you're the founder and you want to replace yourself, you need to be absolutely open about the rationale and the challenges, because again, a great candidate will always sense trouble. They'll think, you know what, this doesn't seem right. Like, who are the stakeholders? What is everyone thinking, right? If the founder is not replacing himself, you need to involve the founder, right? The founder needs to be part of this process, because any smart candidate is going to want to speak to the founder, right? And if they don't want to speak to the founder, they're not a smart candidate, you don't want to hire them. Don't fudge the role, and also don't be constrained by the founder's compensation, right? The fact that the founder's earning peanuts, well, that may or may not be true, but of course, that was then. The founder obviously is plenty compensated on the equity side. You need to understand that the candidate is coming from a different angle. These are mistakes that people make all the time. Now here's something which is common to most of our clients. Everyone wants an amazing person, and nobody wants to pay for it, right? I mean, I hold my hand up. In fact, I'd be very surprised if there was anyone in the room to whom this didn't apply, right? Everyone wants a great person. Funnily enough, the budget is actually only, in our experience, only loosely correlated with the financial strength of the company. Oftentimes it's to do with the company's own perceived value in the market. It's to do with salary bands, a whole bunch of other stuff. But regardless, this is a scenario that happens a lot, and it's not easy. It's not easy. One of the things to do, one of the most sort of effective tools for getting someone great is to find a rising star. Again, it's obvious, but it does work. It does work. Find someone who you can invest in, somebody who's willing to come in for a lower salary, for lower comp, but somebody who you absolutely see as potentially a leader of your company. Much, much better to do that than to try and haggle a senior person down. Expand the role. And we see this all the time. It's quite amazing how many times we see people move at very, very senior roles in big companies and will take a 50% pay cut. It happens a lot. It happens a lot. We've just recently placed somebody at a global media company whose salary is being, who's taken, I think it's something like an 80% pay cut. And this person had been earning a lot of money before, but still, I mean, that's quite an extraordinary cut. And why would they do that? They would do that because the new role is so interesting, right? The new role is so interesting. If somebody has been in a particular function all their lives, and they're desperate to expand, they're desperate to spread their wings, this is the opportunity. This is the time to do it. Right? This is a really, really effective way of bringing in great talent without breaking the bank. And I suppose a related point is that people really are driven by all sorts of things. I'm sure many of you or most of you would have negotiated commercial contracts probably throughout most of your working lives, and the good negotiators will know to bring as many different things into the negotiation as possible, right? Expand the negotiation. It's the sort of classic mantra of all negotiation theory, you know? Don't assume. Well, that's never more true than when hiring somebody. People have all sorts of different ideas, they have all sorts of different ambitions and different needs, and you'll be amazed when you open up the discussion. You'll be amazed at how you can really bring somebody and, you know, excite somebody to come and join you for a budget that makes sense to you because of other components. It may be, you know, working 4 days a week, it may be working from home, it could be anything. But really, this is when your negotiation skills become really, really important. Hiring new leadership for a troubled company. This is, by definition, difficult. But it's also, we can all think of plenty of examples where companies that have been in big trouble have hired amazing leaders. You know, one only has to look at some of the big Silicon Valley businesses, which until, you know, the last 4 or 5 years had, you know, were really some of the most valuable companies in the world, have basically reinvented themselves, or have tried to reinvent themselves by bringing on board amazing talent. You know, you can look at Yahoo, you can look at AOL, and there's lots and lots of examples. So it's quite clear that it's doable. The question is, how do you do it when you're not Yahoo or AOL, right? And that's not easy, but there are ways of doing it. And one of the most effective things, sometimes solving big problems can best be done by attacking particular aspects of the process. That's true in many scenarios. It's particularly true in hiring. One of the most effective techniques that I've ever seen has been simply, very simple, changing the interview order. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a personal example. I was headhunted to join a firm that was going absolutely nowhere, that at one stage was the darling of the tech industry in Europe. It had attracted a lot of VC capital. It was in all the tech press. It was making a big noise. It quickly went from 0 to, I think, 40 or 50 million pound turnover, and then went absolutely nowhere for the next 3 years. Right? It was kind of stuck. The market, it turned out, wasn't nearly as interesting as anyone had thought. It's highly competitive. By that stage, I think there were 4 VCs. They all hated each other. Everyone wanted to get out. No one knew how. The founding CEO tried everything, and they came to me. This is what's known as the Hail Mary role. For those of you who know American football, the Hail Mary is the pass at the end of the game when a team is down to 2 or 3 seconds in the game. The team are in their own half. They're desperate for a touchdown. The quarterback throws the ball as high and as far as he can, hopes that someone will catch it. That's the Hail Mary, because as he throws it, he says, Hail Mary. It's the Hail Mary role, right? Come in, Rob. You're a miracle worker. Fix everything, okay? This is absolutely, for any smart executive, these are the roles that you run a mile from, right? It's like, the founding CEO, in this case, was like the smartest guy in the industry, and he's tried everything with the best backers, and he failed, and I'm going to succeed? It's just not really that credible, right? So what they did for me, and I've seen this done a few times, it's become quite commonplace, is they changed the interview order. They acknowledged right up front that this business is a complete basket case. And rather than interview me, they allowed me to interview them. So the first people I met were the board, right? And they didn't ask me one question in 2 hours. They just sat there and they listened to me while I asked them questions about why the business wasn't succeeding, what the hidden gems were, why they were interested in someone like me, and 1,000,001 questions that I had for them, because ultimately, somewhere in that business potentially was something very interesting, right? There was a reason why people got so excited, right? And I wanted to find out what that reason was. And the board were happy to sit there and let me ask those questions. And they did that to a few people, a lot of whom I actually know, and one of whom actually took the role. And they would never, ever have taken the role had they not approached it in that way. And in fact, for various reasons, I didn't continue with the process, but that process continued. It continued. So in fact, the first 3 or 4 interviews were all about the candidate interviewing first the board, then the senior executive team, and then the sort of levels below that. Right? Very, very effective. Again, I think there's a theme here. A lot of this is about honesty and transparency. If you want to get great candidates, you have to assume that these guys are smart. You have to assume that these guys are skeptical, right? You can't fool people, and you certainly can't fool people and expect to have a successful hire. You really need to be completely open. How am I doing for time?
You're doing great.
Okay. Clean up the cap table. Right. So I know you were giving me that look.
Yeah, we've got like 7-8 minutes. If you have to leave at
No, this is fine.
Then,
this is good.
Yeah, cool.
So the cap table is obviously really important. I mean, this is something which, again, it's not relevant to all companies, but it's certainly relevant to the sort of high growth, predominantly internet companies that I'm familiar with and have worked for. Typically, when a company's in trouble, the cap table is a mess, right? The two things go hand in hand. Because at that stage, there will have been a whole bunch of emergency funding rounds sometimes. Sometimes you'll have multiple funders with multiple liquidation preferences, etc., etc. It's usually a complete mess. And for someone coming in as a chief executive or a senior leader in the business, that's just a non-starter. This is really a hygiene point, but it's often ignored. Hiring an entrepreneur. This is sort of interesting one, right? Because this is a contradiction in terms, right? Hiring an entrepreneur is a contradiction in terms. Entrepreneurs do not want to be hired. But of course, all companies want entrepreneurial DNA in them, right? You all want to get people who have all of the good stuff that's associated with being an entrepreneur, like you're go-getting and you're scrappy and you're flexible and you're driven and all the rest of it, right? Everyone wants that in their business. There's not a business in the world that doesn't want that, okay? But the problem is, if you're trying to hire an entrepreneur, then you're doing the impossible. Anyone who's going to come work for you is not an entrepreneur. Okay, so how do you do this? Well, first of all, I think people need to understand what they actually want when they want someone that's entrepreneurial. We'll come on to that. But the first thing is, do not oversell. Do not oversell. Do not say, which a lot of companies do, it's like being an entrepreneur within my business, right? It's very, very tempting. I've done it before. You find someone, you want someone to sort of grow something within your company. You want someone to take your company from this country to that country. You want to take them from this product set to that product set. You want to grow very, very fast in this particular area, whatever the particular scenario is. It's very easy to say, and people often do, look, it's just like being an entrepreneur, but it's better, right? Because you don't have to buy a photocopier, right? There's an office, and there's like people and stuff, right? And we have a product, and we have revenue. So it's like all that annoying stuff about an entrepreneur, like you don't have that. You've got all the cool stuff, right? Which is like you just get to do what you want to do and build this massive business and make your own decisions and be your own boss. It's nonsense, right? It's nonsense. Anyone who's been an entrepreneur knows that there's nothing is like being an entrepreneur. If you're an entrepreneur, you're an entrepreneur, right? If you work in a corporate, you work in a corporate. So do not oversell it, because what will happen is that when you get someone who's really, really entrepreneurial, who comes in and then realizes that actually, you know what, there is a whole bunch of other decision makers and stakeholders that they're all bound by, then that person will leave, right? So there's just no point in overselling this role. And the flip side is really, really understand this person's motivations. If they are a true entrepreneur, you should really not be hiring them, okay? Because it will not work. And of course, fit is really, really important for the same reason. Let's just move quickly on, because I want to take some questions, right? Sure. So investors in the hiring process, I think perhaps that's something I could just touch on very briefly, but it always helps to have investors involved if you want to hire a senior person, get your board involved, but manage the board very, very closely. Brief them, be systematic, plan ahead. And if you have a run of bad hires, don't assume that you've had a run of bad luck. That's very, very unusual to have a run of bad luck. It's much, much more common that something is broken in your systems, the role spec is wrong, and again, when you're interviewing people, make sure that you're candid about the history of the role. Do not criticize previous incumbents. A smart candidate will assume that the previous 3 people were just as smart as them, right? So do not criticize them. Look at yourselves, review the interview process. So that was all I had, but I'm more than happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. An inspirational talk, I suppose. Any questions? Because we've got something like 30 seconds for the Q&A session. In any case, yes, please. Please state your name and...
Hi, my name's Ernest Janos, and what I found interesting is that when you were talking about the A candidate with the C budget as well as the hiring an entrepreneur, I didn't hear anything about share options. So I was just wondering, what's your experience with equity as part of the compensation?
Well, look, so equity is in some ways the cheapest thing to give away, in some ways the most expensive, right? I mean, again, as a founder, as a CEO, again, it depends who you are. You typically tend to so the value that you place on equity will tend to be at the one end of the spectrum. So because you're founding your own business, so you obviously want to build long-term value. Someone who comes in may or may not be motivated by that. I think there are an awful lot of assumptions around, and there's like typically that role attracts that level of equity, which I've always thought was ridiculous. Because actually what it misunderstands is that people are motivated by different things. Can be incredibly important and valuable, and of course as an incentive, long-term commitment, etc. It's useful. For some people it's completely irrelevant.
All right. Any other questions? You are, I think, I said it was so inspirational because I think a lot of people here were kind of intimidated by the scale of the problems you were discussing. Because I think most of us here, well, I have a company where it's just one person working, it's me, and for a long time I wanted to fire me, but I was hired badly. But in any case, most of the people here, I suppose, are small, medium-sized businesses. So, and they, I believe, are inspired by dreaming big. That one time they will deal with the problems that you were discussing.
So let me just make an observation on that point. All companies at one stage were small companies, right? That's how business works. when your business grows fast, you run up against these so quickly. You will not believe it, right? And I know that all of you want your business to grow fast, otherwise you'll start a new business, right? That's how it works. At some point, when you're successful, if you're already successful, or if your business has already reached a certain scale, you will come across these issues. These issues are so common, and they are common from top to bottom. I hope at least some aspects of what I've said will be relevant at some point.
Sure. All right, and it's 11 o'clock, so you've got to run and say, as you return to Britain, say hi to John Smith from Andres Business, okay?
I will. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.